The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. We enjoy a remarkable level of prosperity in America today, and economists have extensively studied the economic and political requirements for prosperity. Economic freedom to invest is certainly important, and this requires at least a minimum of political freedom and stability, as people are unlikely to invest if a king, emperor, or government generally is going to seize their property, or if their property is likely going to be destroyed in a civil war. One of the successful cases of limited government and prosperity from medieval Europe comes from Venice, Italy, of all places. And what were the secrets of Venice's success? This is a question which my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dan Smith, has been researching extensively over the past several years. In collaboration with some students and some of our other colleagues, he's been investigating what exactly has led to Venice's success. Well, welcome back to the show, Dan.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here again.
So today we think of Venice as this rather unique place with canals for streets and gondolas all over the place. But it was actually in medieval Europe actually a very prosperous place, right?
Yeah, so while we think of it as being part of Italy right now, it used to be its own city-state, which actually extended to be a very large and extensive empire that spanned a good part of the Mediterranean world at that time, and was one of the richest cities in all of Europe during this time.
Now, that prosperity would be in some sense surprising, because if you think of what does Venice have going for it? It's actually, as you might suggest, you may be able to guess because of the canals, it's actually out in the middle of a lagoon along the Italian coast, right? So it doesn't seem like the place of prosperity is likely to occur.
Yeah, in fact, earlier the first Venetians actually fled German hordes as well as the Roman Empire by escaping to the lagoons that were infested with bugs and diseases, didn't have land, is essentially like swampland that they took trees out to kind of build on, and they fled there because they knew no ruler would bother chasing them out there because the land was so invaluable it wasn't worth their time.
And of course, then they didn't have any real resources out there in the middle of the swamp, did they?
No, they in fact, that's what motivated my initial research into Venice with one of our students, Rania El-Bawab, one of our successful master's students, and we'll talk about her master's thesis in a second. But it was the fact that they had such limited resources and were so out of the way, and out of nothing emerged this very prosperous city that became the envy of most of medieval Europe.
And the fact that a country or a city-state doesn't need to have lots of natural resources to be prosperous is not a surprise to economists, right?
Not to economists, but to many non-economists, it does seem puzzling. Modern examples, of course, are places like Hong Kong, where essentially a rock with very limited resources, but they had the right institutions and stable institutions. And if you create the right set of rules that enable people to conduct business, make long-term plans, well, then you're going to attract residents and create a long-term prosperity.
So with the right political rules, you can have prosperity, and that's going to really get us into the big issue and the bigger that so many economists have been studying, like what are the conditions you need to have the right rules in place and the right political conditions for growth. But let's talk a little bit about exactly when Venice was this prosperous city-state, and a little bit about the extent of Venice's scope and their prosperity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as we mentioned, the institutions, which are kind of the rules that govern how we behave, are really important for generating economic growth and prosperity. And what we find in Venice is they created a set of institutions to avoid the tyranny that was occurring across the rest of Europe, and especially in other Italian city-states at that time. So they really thought long and carefully about what types of institutions that they wanted to implement in order to prevent the emergence of tyranny.
And they ended up being quite prosperous, and was sort of like, what was the nature or what was the basis of their economy during this time?
So during this time, they engaged in a lot of long-distance trade, so voyages that would take 6 months to over a year. So this is why political stability was such an attractive feature, and something that the Venetians really wanted to implement, because they were doing these long-term contracts and engaging in creating partnerships or halfway around the world, shipping spices and other types of goods and bring them to different parts of the world. And they kind of became the gateway in between a lot of different worlds at that point, importing a lot of goods from Asia and Africa and bringing them into Europe, and from goods from Europe and getting them out to Asia and Africa. So it was just facilitating this exchange primarily as merchants that they ended up creating such great prosperity.
And this was part of, I think if I recall correctly, about at the same time that there was a general revival of trade that started to occur in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the Dark Ages. And this period of the revival of trade has been one that a lot of economic historians have studied recently, and I think learning a lot from this, because we had to figure out ways to create institutions to allow trade to revive itself, right?
Yeah, you had to have a remarkable degree of what we call institutional entrepreneurship, where people designed institutions specifically to overcome the problems inherent in that world. There wasn't a lot of safety. You're traveling; it's dangerous. How do we have a currency that's going to be stable over time? How do people adhere to contracts? How do I know you're going to keep your promises? People devised an array of institutions during this time across Europe to help facilitate exchange. And Venice offers another example of this type of ingenuity.
And some of those institutions include like the development of commercial law for the very first time, and means by which merchants could have somebody representing them in their affairs, like say across the Mediterranean, and do it in such a way that they could actually trust that their agent was actually going to serve their interests, not just steal any money they gave them, right?
Yeah, it's very hard to engage, especially in long distance trade, without some degree of trust. Embodied in an official law, where we know, okay, if this happens, this will be the outcome. You're responsible, I'm responsible, depending on what type of contingency emerges, because obviously weather's going to emerge, and maybe a ship is attacked by pirates. What do we do in that case? Who's responsible? Who ends up taking the financial loss?
Right.
Well, that can be embodied in the rule of law, so that we're aware of ahead of time, and that enables us to account for that risk when we're engaging in transactions ex ante. So that facilitates these transactions, even though there's all sorts of problems that we could experience while engaging in trade.
And this was a time in which the kings or lords around Europe weren't always so receptive to the idea of trade, or allowing people to keep any wealth they happened to be creating anyway. So I mean, this was particularly important in terms of creating the institutions that could help protect what was going on here, right?
Absolutely, especially during this time, the kings, lords, essentially, tyrants in some cases, like to restrict trade in favor of creating a monopoly usually for some of their friends, and that ended up hurting the welfare of everyone else in their country.
All right, so let's get into some of the details then with Venice. So let's talk a little bit about when the Venetian city-state that we're going to be talking about was founded, to let everybody know, and then a little bit about what was involved there.
Yeah, so I'm primarily looking at a period from about 1172 to 1797. Though you could find doges, which are the leaders of Venice that I'll be talking about, going back all the way to 300, the very, very early days during the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire. The elite patricians of Venice ended up creating a democracy, and they're the ones that elected the leaders and filled the positions in government. So it's important. While they are a democracy, it's only among the elite that represented about 1 to 5% of the population. Over that period, that could represent 500 to up to 2,500 elites that were actually doing the voting. They also had several different self-governing institutions in place beyond the ones that we're going to discuss today. So this is an ongoing research project, but they had a lot of fascinating things embodied in their constitution. It wasn't an officially written constitution, but constitution, generally speaking, the rules that they set and abided by for governance. This included the dispersion of governance among many different councils and committees, so overlapping jurisdictions. And some of these were the early American founding fathers actually pointed to Venice in a couple different spots, saying, "Hey, we can learn from how they set up their constitution, which was which is the longest-standing constitution in world history, actually." Complicated electoral procedures, and we'll cover what I mean by that. Strict formal terms and term limits on nearly every government position. They had a very interesting evolving oath of office, which was like a contract constitution that every time you had a new leader in position, a new Doge, at their death, they would write a new constitution before the new Doge was elected. And they would incorporate any lessons learned, saying, okay, well, the last leader ended up exploiting power in this capacity, or they found a loophole in the last constitution, so we're going to extend the law and create and fill in that gap. And so initially this oath of office was somewhere around 11 to 20 pages. At the end, it was all the way over 300 pages. So they found a lot of loopholes.
And so this was over 600 years that Venice had, I guess, what we would refer to today as a republic. And so that in itself is another notable thing. This was a long-lasting republic with reasonably limited government, certainly limited government in terms of avoiding tyranny, which is so common in Europe, and certainly over a span of 600 years. I mean, I don't think there's probably anywhere else in Europe you could look at where there wasn't some tyrannical leader over that period of time, right?
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating is studying how the Venetians were able to prevent tyranny from emerging. One person from taking power and putting up trade restrictions and creating monopolies. How did they prevent that type of tyranny from emerging? So
you mentioned that they have a bunch of different levels of government, and so this is just I mean, it's really quite amazing. If this is what they had as part of their leadership structure, right?
Yeah, so very complicated electoral procedures, and I should mention here at the bottom, the co-author I mentioned before, Rania El-Bawab, she actually wrote her master's thesis here at Troy University and was one of our most successful graduate students. So this is actually available in the Troy University Library as well as in the Johnson Center. But she is the one that discovered this complicated electoral procedure, and she brought it to me, and I was fascinated by it because it's 12 different stages, and it starts off with finding the youngest boy outside the west door of the basilica, and then they pull balls out of an urn for all the members of the Great Council, which is all the elite patricians, and you can narrow it down to like 40 people, and then those 40 people elect 9 people, and then those 9 people draw balls out of urn. It's in just various iterations of randomness, so you actually get to a 41-person committee at the very end that nominates the next Doge.
Okay, and so then the Doge was their chief leader, or I guess their chief executive officer, right?
Yeah, the most powerful position in all of Venice at this time. They resided in the ducal palace, and they had the authority to negotiate with other countries. They sat at the top of many of the most important committees. They had a deciding vote in many of those committees. In what we would call the Senate, they actually had 2 votes. So a lot of decision-making power was embodied in that position.
And you mentioned that they had a variety of different terms, and both fixed terms of office and term limits, and this sort of shows some of the alternatives there. But I think the thing that's interesting about this, and is the fact that although they have terms of like 6 months or down to 1 month or even 1 week for some of their offices, the Doge was selected or elected, depending on how you'd want to describe that process, selected for life and had a life term, right?
Yeah, and so this was very, very mysterious to an economist, because obviously they had appreciation and understanding of the benefits of term limits, and they applied it, very strict term limits across the board on every government position except for the most powerful one. So this was the puzzle: is what was going on there? Why would they not, if term limits were so effective and useful, why would they not apply them to the leader, to the most powerful leader?
And before we get into that a little bit more, and another thing that they had in here, which I think is interesting to note, is that they have random selection, some degree of random selection, which they didn't pioneer or introduce that. I think that goes back to Athens, where they would draw some representatives by lot. But explain why that can sometimes be a interesting or a good way to sort of restrict or check tyranny.
Yeah, so part of it was that they were trying to prevent what they called electioneering. They didn't want you weren't allowed to campaign for office in Venice. And in fact, if during the voting process you signaled at all, you were kicked out and weren't allowed to be nominated. You weren't allowed to nod at anyone or like smile or wink. They actually had specific laws going over cases where someone would nod at someone and then have to be kicked out. Oh, that's electioneering. You're politicking. That's not allowed. So they're preventing people from forming what we'd call minimum winning coalitions. So people that are trying to say, hey, I'll promise you goodies once I'm elected if you vote for me. So and we see this in U.S. politics, or democratic politics more broadly, where politicians essentially buy the office by promising favors to special interest groups. Well, in Venice, we didn't know who was actually going to be electing the next Doge. It was random. So it was nearly impossible for them to electioneer or politic in the way that we traditionally understand in the U.S.
So I guess you could also see sort of by having like their chief executive hold office for life, as opposed to being elected frequently or having to be reelected, they're avoiding the possibility that that person could engage in electioneering. But it would also seem to be the case that if they're concerned about tyranny, having somebody hold office for the rest of their life, be president for life, so to speak, because we clearly see that in a lot of like Latin American countries when democracy collapses, somebody names himself president for life. That doesn't seem like the best way to prevent tyranny, but it seemed to end up working, right?
Yeah, and once again, that's just another factor that led me to dig in this deeper. Is okay. So here's another reason why they shouldn't have a leader in position for life. Why are they doing that? And that investigation actually led to one of my working papers that I have with George Crowley here at Troy University, and then Sebastian Leguizamon, who's currently at Western Kentucky University, and we came up with a theory and an argument and supported it with evidence that the reasons that why Venetians elected a Doge for life rather than term limiting them is they were trying to they wanted the ability to be able to select ahead of time the tenure length of the executive. So what I mean by that is by electing someone old to office, they can informally term limit them and ensure that they did not get rid of the formal term limits, because they're about to die anyways. So they ended up purposely electing older Doges to office to term limit them informally. Because what they were doing is they were looking at all the other city-states and all the other countries across Europe at this time, and they saw that a young and ambitious leader could just simply dispense with the formal term limits. And this is something we've seen in modern times: Russia, China, Argentina. This happens all the time, where someone gets enough power that they say, okay, those formal term limits no longer apply to me. So the Venetians, instead of they know that's a possibility, well, why don't we just elect on a normal basis old people to that office that are going to die in a couple of years anyways, and that way we don't have to worry about them getting rid of the formal term limits.
And by electing them for life, I mean, you're in effect telling the person, well, you don't have to worry about coming to the end of your term, because presumably whoever's the Doge isn't going to want to have to leave office. so they don't have to leave office because they don't actually face a formal end of their eligibility to be Doge, but they also don't have an incentive to do a lot more to really sort of invest in undermining the rules of the Republic, right?
Yeah, so it ended up accomplishing both of those tasks, which is pretty ingenious, especially during this time that they came up with this unique institution for that. And when you look at the evidence, they largely preferred short-term doges that were young and served very short tenures in office.
Now, it's sort of amazing if you think about this whole principle, because their average age when they were elected was 69 years, and well, this was back starting in 1200. I mean, I don't imagine that lots of people lived to be 80, 90, or 100 years old back in those days, right?
Correct. The average age during this time in Italy was around 40 years old. So that was your life expectancy. And so people in government, the elites, probably lived longer. So the average age of elites at that time was around 50 to 60. So they're electing doges that are even older than that. So these are really, really old individuals. In fact, there's one doge that was elected so old that he kept falling asleep in his throne. So they had to put a contraption across the throne so he wouldn't slide out of his chair and hit the floor and disrupt the meetings.
Well, that raises a good point. It would be one that I guess many Americans just hearing about this for the first time would think, well, one of the problems is that you're electing such old persons to this office. I mean, aren't they going to be sort of infirm, maybe senile, not really capable of doing very much other than just sort of sitting there and maybe, if they're lucky, staying awake during a meeting? So wasn't there going to be some cost, and a pretty significant cost, it might seem to us, to having a doge or a chief executive who really wasn't nearly as capable as they might have been had they been elected 15 years earlier in their lives?
Yeah, so there were a couple examples, especially one elderly doge that lost his son and then became so ineffective that they actually asked him to resign by offering him a public pension. But that's actually fairly rare. They actually seem to enjoy and appreciate a doge that decided not to be ambitious. In fact, that's what, arguably one of the many factors that led to the prosperity that Venice had, is that they didn't have anyone young and ambitious that was going to intervene in government frequently. Having someone that's more willing to just be traditional and conserve the institutions that they have and prevent anything crazy from happening tends to be a benefit when it comes to institutions that are conducive for economic growth and prosperity.
And to some extent, they also, in Venice, they limited the powers of the doge. So they were trying to prevent tyranny, and they did it in part by selecting elderly patricians to be the doge, but they also did the doge didn't have the most formal powers. They really did have this extensive levels of government, and they had other people in government doing a lot of the work, right? Yeah,
and this system of overlapping committees was supplemented by having an elderly doge. Maybe they weren't very effective in office, and they fell asleep during meetings, but that meant that you maintained the overlapping jurisdictions and maintained power outside of just the doge. Whereas if you had a young and ambitious doge, they might tend to dominate those committees, where an elderly one would allow this overlapping political sources of political power to flourish and operate.
Now, you mentioned that they didn't have an official term limit, and that actually gave them some flexibility as well. And there were some times where they might have wanted to choose a younger, more energetic doge, right?
Yeah. So what we did is we analyzed during wartime. We went through and said, well, during wartime, would they prefer a younger doge that could actually wage the war, so they didn't have to change horses midstream, so to speak? And we found a lot of evidence supporting that. During wartime, they suspended this and voted in young, energetic military commanders into office. Other cases that we found this is during times of when the Black Plague hit Italy in the 14th century, when there's a famine and disease. So we found a couple episodes where, okay, we're kind of in a chaotic moment. We actually need someone effective in that leadership position. So the informal term limits gave them the flexibility to vote in someone younger at those times.
I'm curious. I know back in Rome, the emperor was often out leading armies. Was the Doge their military commander as well, or during these wars, or was it simply that they wanted somebody a little more younger, because they were still selecting, I guess, relatively old, more than 63 is their average age of their wartime Doges, or was it somebody simply like making the decisions, making the negotiations?
Typically, they were military commanders prior to being elected during this time. So they're a recognized military leader. Okay, now we're in time of war, let's elect that person. Infrequently, the Doges were actually out leading a war. Usually they're just, giving the orders back home, but that was still a tasking job that was probably something that an elderly Doge could not accomplish.
Yeah, you probably didn't want somebody falling asleep while they're trying to negotiate to end a war.
Absolutely.
So, is there'd be another way if we looked at what Venice was doing by selecting these elderly Doges? I mean, another explanation for that could be to say, well, maybe just Venice in their culture or their heritage or whatever just really respected age and wisdom and a record of public service, as opposed to choosing somebody they know didn't have a long enough time horizon to worry about trying to undermine the laws of the Republic. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's the explanation most historians give, is that the Venetians just appreciated wisdom and experience. Our explanation and theory it's not necessarily in contention with that, but we think that's insufficient to explain everything that's going on. And that is particularly, you can see during wartime when they most needed someone, someone wise and a capable leader. That's when they suspended that and actually went with younger people. So they're demonstrating that actually during hard times, we want younger people, not older people. So that goes against that wisdom and experience argument. We find examples where they pass over what historians argue are clearly this was a better ducal candidate. Has a lot more experience, from a better family, more wealthy, and they're passed over in favor of an older person. So you get plenty of examples where historians are scratching their heads saying, why did this person lose the election? Well, they weren't going after wisdom and experience. They were going after elderly candidates in most cases.
And that's an important point to bring up, because in our research, when you're trying to offer an explanation for what we observed in the economy or in history with these rules here, it's really important that you consider alternative explanations or other ways you could explain what it is you're trying to explain, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where economists can add to the discussion, especially in fields like history, where historians have focused on one explanation and then coming at it through the economic lens, we can kind of look at the data and the anecdotal evidence and say, wait, hold on, that may be part of the picture, but I think there might be something more interesting going on here.
If the whole goal was to have political stability, one element of stability would be to make sure that you didn't have a lot of infighting or political civil wars. And there's some really good evidence that Venice was quite successful in this, right?
It is very rare compared to the rest of Europe at this time, and prior to this period during the Roman Empire, where they had a lot of assassinations, a lot of infighting, civil war. In contrast to that, Venice was a very peaceful area, no assassinations. There was one Doge executed, and then two removed from office internally, given a public pension to resign. Then one was actually removed at the tail end of this period by Napoleon.
And I think it's pretty amazing. You have this statistic there: 15% of European monarchs were assassinated, assassinated during this similar period of time when Venice was in place here. So I mean, it was a wonderful success. I guess it helped lead the prosperity that helped Europe get out of the Dark Ages and move into the Enlightenment and eventually the Renaissance, right?
And served as example for the young American Republic as well.
Well, this is a really fascinating example of really research looking at the big question in political economy, the rules that allow for prosperity, right?
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming on and talk about this. I enjoyed it very much. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.